You are listening to The Creative Imposter, episode 110. Welcome to The Creative Imposter. I'm Andrea Klunder, and I want to have a little heart-to-heart with you today. This is a totally off-the-cuff, unscripted, though not unedited, talk about where we are right now, how we are right now. And I don't totally know exactly how you are unless you've been on my twice weekly community Zoom calls, or unless you've been on my show, or really, those are the only two ways that I may have interacted with you as of late. And I just moments ago got off of a recording session with Pat Wetzel, who you heard in a previous episode of The Creative Imposter talking about Cancer Road Trip. And we were recording a conversation for her brand new podcast, Bump in the Road. I love when I get to be a podcast guest rather than a podcast host. For some reason, I get more nervous being a guest than being a host. I don't know, maybe it's that creative imposter need to try to control the situation, but I'm getting better at guesting, I think. And anyway, Pat is such a great soul who really is good at facilitating the space for you to connect with what's important to you and tell your story. And the whole premise of her podcast is, bump in the road. We know what that means, right? It's when things are going along one way and then, whoops, not going along so great. There's a hiccup. There's a problem. There's a change of plans that is required and maybe not welcome. And how do we navigate past that? And I think that we could safely say that the vast majority of us, could we say all of us, have in 2020 hit a bump in the road. What are the chances that we would all hit one at roughly the same time? But it looks different for each one of us, right? I was recently editing an interview with Pam Covarrubias from Café Con Pam for my other podcast, Podcast Envy, which is all about the craft and culture of podcasting. So if you are a podcaster or an aspiring podcaster, you definitely want to make sure you're listening to Podcast Envy. But when I asked Pam for that interview about the opportunities that are available for us during the time of COVID and pandemic and coronavirus and shelter in place, she hesitated and backtracked a little bit to state that while, yes, there may be opportunities for us here, it is also important to acknowledge that we were discussing this from a place of relative privilege, of relative comfort, where our lives were maybe not immediately being threatened, or even comfier still, our livelihoods were not being immediately threatened. And that it was important to state that we were viewing this idea of opportunities during COVID through that lens. And so back to my interview with Pat for Bump in the Road, she had asked me to think of a story from my own life of when I hit a bump in the road. And there have been several, and some are giant Chicago winter-sized potholes, if I'm being honest. And the one that maybe was not the most life-threatening, but was definitely the most informative, transformative for my life trajectory so far, was one that I've talked about here on The Creative Imposter before, though I don't know how recently that was. And that was when I closed my first business, my yoga studio and spa, Infuse Yoga Spa in Chicago, after 5 years in business, completely broke with tens of thousands of dollars of credit card debt, credit cards that had been used to pay for business expenses and for groceries, and certainly not for social or entertainment, because when I was hustling to make a failing business work, I certainly didn't have the time and energy for social and entertainment. So yeah, I was broke. I was exhausted. I was demoralized, I was depressed, and I was experiencing that feeling when the identity that you have been building feels like it gets ripped out from underneath you. That identity was entrepreneur, business owner, yoga studio owner, yoga teacher. And in that moment, I didn't have any of those to cling on to. The identities that I felt like I could cling on to were Andrea Klunder, failure, former business owner, broke ass single girl with no idea what to do next and no will to do anything about it. And sure, well-meaning friends and family were like, you could start a new business, except I had no money and it's hard to do that. You could just polish off that resume and go get a new job. Except once you've worked for yourself, it's really hard to put yourself back in that box. And so this was the story that I told on Pat's podcast. And of course, you can hear those details once the episode is released. Like I said, we just recorded, so it will be some weeks before it comes out. And so I will let you know when that interview is available. But it really got me thinking. And specifically, it got me thinking because at the end of the interview, she asked a question, which was, what advice do you have for a business owner or an entrepreneur at this time who is struggling because of outside forces, because of things beyond our control, whose business is really not going so well and is thinking, this isn't working, this isn't working. What can we do? And when she asked that, I was like, do I have any advice? I mean, my business has taken a dip for sure, but not as bad as I was anticipating at first when I lost my first client due to the client not being able to afford to pay my fees due to online advertising, her main revenue source basically going away. Not going away, but taking a major hit. And the advice that I did end up giving kind of surprised me. It kind of surprised me because I started off by saying that a lot of businesses aren't going to survive. And I don't want to be pessimistic. I really don't. But it's true. We've already seen it happening. I know in my neighborhood, long-time restaurants and coffee shops and cafes and bookshops aren't making it, despite their efforts to put together a GoFundMe, despite the support that they're getting from the community. They just can't survive. And what I followed that up with is, it's okay. It's okay if the business can't survive. It's okay if it has to close. It sucks. But that person or people behind the business, they can survive. They can be okay, even if the business isn't okay. And in the short term, sure, they might not be okay. I wasn't okay in the short term when my business closed. And that was not due to a global pandemic. But we are resilient, we are resourceful, and we are creative. And if we are okay, if we can help ourselves be okay, then we can do something different. We can survive. And even the businesses that do survive are going to look different on the other side of this. Is there another side of this, or is this just ongoing forever and ever? God, that's my worst fear, is that this is just going on forever and ever. You know, that whole phrase, the new normal. Yeah, fuck that. Anyway, those businesses, organizations, etc., that do survive, things are going to look very different. We can't just continue business as usual. We don't have that luxury. We have to dig deep into our inner resources and into our own creativity and into our own resilience and see what's there. And I'll be honest with you, I got to the end of the interviews that I recorded for the Creative Imposter series on creative pandemic pivots, and that was really motivating me and keeping me going. And then I just kind of hit a wall. Like, what else do I want to talk about? I don't want to keep talking about this, but what else do I want to talk about? What else is there to talk about? And what's the point? What's the point? All of the things that matter to me, I can't do, or Someone was asking me, do you think you'll live in Chicago forever? And I'm like, what's the point of living in this crowded, congested, expensive city if all of the things that I love about the city are not available to me, are not something that we can do? If I'm just staying at home and in my little concrete back patio that's barely big enough for a hammock, and I can't go to all the fabulous restaurants that we have, and I can't go to the lakefront, and I can't see any theater or arts. And there's this part of me that just keeps thinking, what's the point? What's the point? And I'm having a hard time motivating myself. And yes, there are a million pieces of content that I could create. I could create online courses. I could do more social media. I could do more Instagram lives. I could do more Facebook lives. I can have more social Zoom calls, which we're doing. But none of it feels like it matters right now. So when I was talking with Pat, being able to say for the first time, some businesses won't survive. Some structures won't survive. Some habits won't survive. And some will, but they will look very different moving forward. And that's okay. It was like this heavy fog lifted from around my shoulders and my neck and my head. And that's okay. It'll look very different. Instead of being in a place of shutdown, of it doesn't really matter, of I can't do any of the things that I love, of despair, that puts things into the perspective of, well, if it's going to look very different, how do I want it to look? What do I have available to me that I can use to create something that looks different, something that functions differently, something that feels different? And then suddenly possibility, oh, there's a little spark of energy there. There's a question instead of a statement. And that puts us back in the driver's seat. When I closed my yoga business, I didn't know what to do. And so for a while, I didn't do anything. Or I did the bare minimum that I needed to do, like picking up odd jobs here and there, teaching the occasional yoga class, obviously feeding myself, personal care, etc. I just did that without knowing. And it was awful. It was painful. I don't recommend it. But then I found one thing that was interesting to me that I thought, maybe I can do that. And that one thing was podcasting. I had been listening to podcasts. I had been imagining the lives and businesses of these podcasters who I would hear in my headphones day in and day out. And I thought, I don't know how you turn podcasting into a business, but I think I can start a podcast. I think I can do that. And it took about a year for that idea to fully germinate and to scrap together the pieces of free information that I could find online about starting a podcast, and to get my partner to help me figure out the tech and the equipment. And I started the Creative Imposter without much of a plan, which is not at all what I recommend to my podcast launch consulting clients these days. But that's how it worked for me. I didn't have a plan. I just wanted to make a podcast. I just wanted to talk to people who I thought were interesting, who I thought I could learn something from. And then little by little by little, I started to get opportunities. I started to get ideas for ways that I could help other people do the same thing I was doing in their own way, and maybe shorten that learning curve a little bit so it doesn't have to take a full year. And little by little, I started to occupy this new identity, podcaster. And then that morphed into podcast editor, podcast producer, podcast teacher, podcast consultant. And then suddenly a business started to take shape. But I didn't know that's what was going to come from that bump in the road. I didn't know that that was possible. I couldn't see the future. I could only see a few feet, 1 or 2 feet, maybe 6 inches in front of myself at a time. How far away is my microphone right now? Yeah, that's how far I could see ahead of me. And it took time. And it's still growing, and I'm still learning, and I'm still making mistakes, and I'm still having to do that dreaded P word of pivot all the time. And when I try to see far ahead into the future, when I try to look out at that horizon line, it's hard. I can't see it. I get overwhelmed. I feel anxiety about all the things, about education, about politics, about finances, about small business, about mental health. Everyone's mental health. It becomes overwhelming, and I shut down and I say, it doesn't matter. What's the point? But when I can focus closer, when I can pull that focus inward, I can ask myself right now, what can I do? Right now, in this moment, what can I do? And how do I want this to look? And can I be okay with if it looks different than it used to? That is more manageable. And it doesn't always work. Let me tell you, sometimes I'm laying on the floor staring up at the ceiling. And sometimes I'm scrolling through social media with comparisonitis and feeling bad about every little thing that everyone else is doing that I'm not doing. And sometimes I'm complaining to my partner about everything and anything. And sometimes I'm watching The Babysitter's Club on Netflix. Yep, you caught me. But I'm giving myself a little bit of grace. I'm trying to be patient. And I'm trying to remember that I've hit bumps in the road like this before. Well, maybe not like this. But nevertheless, I've been challenged, really challenged before. And I found a way to come out of it. And so if you're feeling like you're in that state of overwhelm or that state of it doesn't really matter, what's the point? Everything is broken. Nothing will ever be the same that it was before. Recognize that's where you are. Take a pause, take a breath. Remember that you've been through a hard time before and you've found your way out of it. Remember that you are resilient, resourceful, and creative, and say, just for right now, what can I do? And if it looks different than I expected, it's okay. One thing I do want to talk about is travel. It's something that I'm really feeling nostalgic about right now, and I'm really missing and really worried I'm never going to have the opportunity to do again. And I have been placating that worry and that fear and that anxiety by listening to other people's travel stories. One such place to do that is the Strangers Abroad podcast by Adrienne Bain. She just wrapped her second season, and you can go back and listen to the whole thing. It's really good. And also, I want to hear from you. Do you have a particularly compelling travel story? I don't know. Maybe you think it's compelling to you, but you're not sure that it's going to be compelling to anyone else. I'll be the judge of that. If you have a travel experience, a travel story that you love to tell, or that you've been dying to tell, but nobody wants to listen, I do. There will be a link in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/110. Thecreativeimposter.com/110, conveniently linked in the episode description in your app. That link will take you to a very short form where you can submit to book a time with me to tell me your travel story. And we'll see if we can feature it on the podcast. Also, if you happen to be a podcaster or aspiring podcaster, over on my other show, Podcast Envy, I'm trying something new, and that is bringing Podcast Envy office hours to Podcast Envy, the show. Office hours are a chance for you to meet with your podcast boss, that's me, one-on-one, and troubleshoot something with your show, or dig deep into something with your show, or solve a problem, or refresh something, or find a new way to go about something having to do with your show or soon to be show, it is a totally complimentary coaching session with me that we can share with other Podcast Envy listeners, because as podcasters, I'm going to go ahead and say that is probably the primary way we learn, is by hearing from each other. The link to sign up for Podcast Envy office hours will also be in the show notes for this episode. This episode was mixed, as always, by Edwin Ruiz of Mondo Machine. Our theme music is by Jovia Armstrong. And this week, breathe. For the love of God, just breathe.